Okay, so now we're just focusing specifically on skeletal muscle until we hit the end of this chapter, and then we're going to compare skeletal muscle to smooth muscle. But going forward until we hit that section, we're just talking about skeletal muscle tissue. And skeletal muscle tissue isn't just made up of skeletal muscle tissue. It actually has other types of tissue innervating it. So, for example, it's going to have some blood vessels. It's going to have nervous tissue because it does have a nerve supply, and even some connective tissue. So each muscle typically receives one nerve, one artery, and then one or more veins. Because we consciously control our skeletal muscle, it does have to have the nerve endings. So that's different and unlike cardiac and smooth muscle because those are under involuntary control. So it doesn't have any nervous system input stimulating each individual cell. So skeletal muscle is different because it is under voluntary control. Each muscle cell or muscle fiber has to be synapsing with at least one nerve or a branch of a nerve. So we make the decision to move. We have to send that signal through our nervous system to each individual muscle cell themselves. Also, anytime we're talking about skeletal muscle, because they require or they utilize a huge amount of force when they contract, they require huge amounts of oxygen and nutrients. And those oxygen and nutrients are delivered to the muscle cells via arteries. As these muscle cells undergo metabolism to produce the large amounts of ATP that they need, they're also going to produce large amounts of waste products. And so we have to have veins there as well. And that's why they have one or more veins in order for them to move all the metabolic waste that have been generated. Skeletal muscle also has three different types of connective sheets. Before, when we talked about connective sheets surrounding other different types of tissue, so for example, osseous tissue, we only really worried about the endosteum and the periosteum. When we're talking about skeletal muscle tissue, there's actually three. So we have the epimysium, which is going to surround the entire muscle itself. We have the endomysium, which is going to surround each individual muscle cell or muscle fiber. But is organized a little bit differently than other tissue types in that we take a group of these muscle fibers or cells and we collect them together and we bunch them up. And each one of these collections or groups of muscle fibers or cells is called a fascicle. So that's what's shown to you right here. And this one's showing you a group of a bunch of different muscle cells or muscle fibers. And then each fascicle has its own connective sheath, and that's called the perimysium. So the epimysium is around the entire muscle. We have the endomysium around each individual muscle cell or muscle fiber. We take a group or a collection of those muscle cells or muscle fibers, and we get a fascicle, and that fascicle is going to be wrapped in the perimysium. It kind of looks like in this picture that each one of these connective sheets is distinct from the other one. However, I just want to point out that all of these sheets are continuous with each other. So let's go a little bit further into the structural and organization levels of skeletal muscle. So we talked about the epimysium surrounding the entire muscle itself. So say we're talking about our bicep or something like that, the epimysium would wrap around that entire muscle. Within an entire muscle or a whole muscle, we have those groupings of muscle fibers called a fascicle. So that's what's shown right here is one fascicle. And now we're taking that fascicle and that's what we're looking at right here. So we have part of a fascicle, which is going to be wrapped in the perimysium connective sheath right there. And what is the fascicle? It's a bunch of these muscle fibers grouped together, wrapped in that connective sheath. If we look down here, we're taking this muscle fiber or muscle cell, and we're looking at a section of that muscle cell or muscle fiber. And we can see that it's wrapped in the connective sheath called the endomysium. Just deep to that connective sheath or the endomysium, we have the sarcolemma, which I mentioned in the first video. Anytime you see sarco, that's going to refer to something muscle related. And in this case, the sarcolemma is the plasma membrane of a muscle cell. So that is deep to the endomysium. So the endomysium is on the outside. We can also see in this picture how we have this striped pattern where we have light areas and dark areas. So that's where we get the striations or the striated appearance. We can also see that we have multiple nuclei kind of squished between all of these myofibrils. And yeah, that's basically what that's showing. Anyway, so what we left off where a bunch of muscle cells or muscle fibers make up a fascicle, but we didn't really talk about what is the component of a muscle cell or muscle fiber itself. So each muscle cell or muscle fiber is a collection of what we call myofibrils. So these are all of the myofibrils that are inside of the muscle cell itself. So let's zoom in on one myofibril. So that one that's pulled out here, that's what you're seeing right there. And what myofibrils are is, we'll talk about them more in a second or in the next video, is these are just the contractile elements. And what they are composed of are these units called sarcomeres. And we link these sarcomeres end to end down the length of the myofibril. And those are the contractile units that we actually shorten in order to contract our muscle. If we take this sarcomere and we zoom in further, we see that the myofibril is actually made up of two different types of myofilaments, and we call these the thin and the thick filament. And this might seem overwhelming right now, but we're going to talk way more about this in future lectures. So again, we have myofibrils that make up a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. And if we look at a myofibril and zoom in, a myofibril is made up of myofilaments, and we have down here shown better our thin filament and our thick filament. And we'll talk about how these play a role in muscle contraction later.